Hi everyone, it's Emily, and apparently I am the worst at keeping you guys up to date with all the games I've been playing lately. So the last update I made officially, I think, was back in April-ish. So there's been quite a few games I've played since then. So I'm going to go over 8 games that I've played so far this year that I haven't talked about in depth yet. That's a lot of games to cover, so I will have a part 2 of this that I will give a little sneak peek about what games we'll be talking about in the next week or two. I try to make these reviews very casual, so they tend to be very rambly and are by no means in-depth reviews at all. So I just kind of share my thoughts about certain games and whatever comes to mind. So I'm going to start off with Trails to Azure because in my last video, I only just started this and I kind of gave some of my first impressions. And now having completed the game, I really adore this. And I think now Crossbell has officially become my favorite of the Trails arcs I've played so far. I really just like how Crossbell is central to everything and you get to meet and interact with all the NPCs multiple times and really get to know them. I don't know, something about that formula just really clicked with me. And I still will argue that the Crossbell duology is a good way or entry point into the Trails franchise because I know with all the number of games, it's very intimidating. I know there are many that would probably disagree with me on this, and that's fine. I do still think that starting with Trails in the Sky is ideal, but not everyone owns a Steam Deck or a modded PS Vita or wants the game on their PC. So I do think that the first Crossbell game, Trails from Zero, is a good starting point just to see if you really want to continue and invest so much time into this great franchise. So when it comes to the sequel, Trails to Azure, you definitely need to play Trails from Zero first because the events that happen here just kind of start off with a bang, and you definitely need all the stuff that happened in the first game to really know what's going on and all the different character dynamics and whatnot. I think a lot of people like to cite Trails to Azure as their favorite entry in the Trails franchise simply because of, I think, how fast-paced it is. There's just so many things that kind of happen one after the other and some cool twists that happen too. And I think you really start to connect with the characters here. Definitely, I think the first game, Trails from Zero, you get to meet everyone and kind of understand the dynamics and kind of how some of the characters think for themselves and whatnot. But you really see a lot of growth in them in the second game here, which I really appreciated. I personally really enjoy the combat system. It's a really cool hybrid of your traditional turn-based systems with some strategic things with the different kind of time slots that you play around with and manipulate to your advantage. But I did notice when it comes to this game, I had a tough time deciding who my party members should be that I should focus on. I think in this game, more than the first game, I had a difficult time choosing who my kind of set party members were because I wanted to play as everyone. And I really liked all the dynamics of the different characters and how they interacted with one another. So I'm trying to remember who my final party was because, sorry, this was a few months back. I really liked using at first Wazi and Noelle together with I think Lloyd and Tio whenever possible. I think they were kind of my fixed party for a while, but then it kind of changed as new abilities and new, I think, restrictions to your party members kind of happened. And when it came to the romancing part, I romanced Risha. So I thought her interactions with Lloyd were interesting. The romancing elements in the Trails games, I would say, are fairly minor, especially in the Crossbell duology, but they're still kind of fun to see what unique cutscene you get depending on different romancing options. And I guess the last thing I want to talk about with this game is how difficult it is to talk about it, especially on a channel like this where I know not everyone has played or really wants to play the Trails franchise, and you don't really want to get into the complexities of some of the character dynamics or how the plot develops down the road, because it's just so riddled with spoilers. So I always kind of struggle to find that good balance of how to talk about it on a channel like this and not give too much away. But overall, I'm just really happy that the Crossbell duology is finally localized, and I definitely encourage people to give it a try. They're into JRPGs, especially with Trails from Zero, the first game in this duology, if you don't want to try the Sky games just yet. So I guess I'll just end this segment by saying that the Trails series, I think, is something very special, and even though it is a very long franchise, I think it's definitely worth giving your time to, especially if you really enjoy a good narrative that constantly changes and develops over the course of many games. This next game is one that I actually had to pause like halfway through Trails to Azure, which, as I mentioned before, I really loved that game. But I was highly anticipating playing this and I didn't want any spoilers to come up on Twitter at all for it. And I'm really glad that I kind of decided to latch onto this game and finish it right away. And that is not the one I'm holding up because unfortunately they did not make a physical copy, but I'm talking about Xenoblade Chronicles 3 DLC Future Redeemed. Leading up to the release of Future Redeemed, I did play a little bit of the other DLC. They had some new characters to play as, and I actually didn't do all the missions or the ascensions and the prior characters for the game. So I kind of went through there and spent maybe 10 hours, maybe 20, playing through it again and really enjoying, again, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which is an amazing game. I highly recommend it. It's one that you can pick up if you haven't played the first or second game yet, though I do recommend starting with the first one so that you can kind of build up to the third one. A lot of people like to describe this as the more polished version of Xenoblade Chronicles. It has a very polished story and battle mechanic system, a very thoroughly enjoyable experience. And I think starting with Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and going chronologically is probably the best way to experience it, just so that you can kind of encounter all the bumps in the road and really enjoy the experience while completing it with the Future Redeemed DLC, which kind of brings everything together. So what's funny about the Xenoblade Chronicles series on the Switch is that everyone was a little uncertain like how they all tied together. But it really wasn't until the Future Redeemed DLC came out that we all understood where they did meet and all kind of meshed together. And what they were building up to and how it connected back to the prior Xeno games with Xenogears and Xenosaga. Similar to how it's difficult to talk about the Trails series, just any entry of it, it's difficult to talk about Future Redeemed as a DLC because it does bring in so many elements from the prior games, and the conclusions it reaches is just, I think, kind of an enlightening experience of how it all comes together. And I actually haven't played Xenogears or Xenosaga at all, so some of those points that were kind of drawbacks, while I was playing Future Redeemed, I kind of understood they were callbacks, but I didn't fully connect about where they kind of lived on that timeline. So I really do want to go back and actually experience those games. Probably first with Xenogears, and I'm really hoping that we'll get that Xenosaga remaster that they kind of been teasing, especially at the end of Future Redeemed. I hope Bandai Namco makes it happen, but we'll see. But when it comes to Future Redeemed, it is its own actual story, very much like Torna was for Xenoblade Chronicles 2. However, because of its ties and callbacks to the prior games, I do kind of recommend not playing it until you experience Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Torna, and the base Xenoblade Chronicles 3 game. I think that's probably the definitive way to play it if you don't have a chance to go back further into the timeline with the Xeno games. But outside of the narrative and how it connects to everything, I think the DLC on its own is a really good game. I think they refined the combat system in a way that improved upon what everyone figured was the definitive way to pursue this multi-level MMO-style combat in the Xenoblade Chronicles games. One of the things I didn't especially enjoy when it came to the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 combat system was just how many different classes there were and how much grinding you really needed to do to level up all your characters in order to get kind of the maxed out stats and abilities. While the freedom to kind of pick and choose was fun, and there's a lot of hours you could stretch if you wanted to max out everything, I did like how they streamlined everything so that each character in Future Redeemed just had one base class, and you would build upon them with different collectibles and just experience of building up their base class. So the combat was great, and it didn't feel just so repetitive as the base Xenoblade Chronicles 3 game felt towards the end. I also like how they handled the exploration and how you had this sort of scavenger hunt where you had to collect a number of items in each area in order to fill out this book. I found that very satisfying, a way to go about the exploration. And the other cool thing about the exploration was revisiting some of the older environments from the prior games and seeing them in sort of a different perspective, how they are in the Future Redeemed DLC. So there are certain areas that felt very familiar in some ways, but also very foreign in other ways. So I thought that was kind of a cool mix that you experienced when just traveling around the different areas in the DLC. But outside of the combat, the story, I thought the characters really shined in Future Redeemed. And I especially loved the transformation we saw between the leads in Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, as well as Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Seeing Shulk and Rex all grown up and interacting with presumably their children was, I thought, really interesting. And it tapped into some interesting dynamics that we never really saw in their characters in the prior games, and just showed kind of how their characters grew and mature to fill in those roles and have the different interaction with some of the younger characters. So Future Redeemed was definitely one of my highlights of this year, and definitely solidified my love for the franchise. And I'm really excited to see what Monolith Soft is going to do next. And I would love to see kind of what other expansions into the Xenoverse we'll see from here. And really just where the story is going to continue going, I think will be really interesting to see. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the game I have not completed, but I did want to talk about it because I do have some thoughts. And that is The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. So this is definitely one of my most anticipated games of the year. And I feel a little silly saying this, but I've only put in like 5.5 hours in this. I'll explain why. I think with my initial impressions and experience with Breath of the Wild, it kind of stilted my experience with Tears of the Kingdom. And I think that's because with Breath of the Wild, when you first start the game, you just have this vast world of possibilities. And I didn't feel so burdened with all the different things to do. Instead, I just felt kind of that sense of freedom where you kind of go any direction you want and you'll encounter something cool. With Tears of the Kingdom, on the other hand, when I first booted up this game and you're in the Sky Islands and everything, I thought the tutorial was done very well to teach you all the new mechanics with the building and whatnot. But there's something about it that felt just a little too restricted for me. And that's because, again, you're stuck on the Sky Islands and you don't have that kind of open space and open world to explore quite yet. So I did enjoy my time completing the tutorial, which again, I put in, was it 3.5 hours or so? Forget how long that took me. But I do remember enjoying it while I was playing it. And again, learning all the different new abilities and how everything worked. But that point where you glide from the Sky Islands down to Hyrule, I just felt so overwhelmed just by everything. There's just so many different markers and areas of the map to explore and so many quests that hit you left and right. I just felt so, again, burdened with all the possibilities of things to do. And in a way that just felt so restrictive to me that I was, I think, unfortunately comparing that experience to how I felt in Breath of the Wild. And I think with just so many different things to do and without that unrestricted feeling of freedom that we had initially in Breath of the Wild, I kind of just set the game down for that reason, just because of how overwhelmed I felt. I do feel like if I were to give a few more hours into the game and start off with exploring a bit more of the main Hyrule area, I would feel a bit better, especially once I kind of clear the map area and have a better orientation of where everything is. So since putting that game down back in May, I haven't picked it back up again. And I really do want to. I'm at the point where I feel like I need to have a huge time slot of time just to devote like 100 hours into it, so I could be fully immersed and really into it like I was with Breath of the Wild a few years ago. I think my plan for next year, or at least at the tail end of this month, I want to pick this back up again and beat it. And again, be fully immersed in it and enjoy everything that is Tears of the Kingdom, because I do know it's an amazing game and I'm sure I'll love it. I just have to kind of get over that initial hurdle of feeling overwhelmed by everything and kind of integrate myself into that mindset where I can just be totally absorbed in the world and kind of explore every nook and cranny of it. The next game I want to talk about is one I never really pictured myself ever playing. That is the mobile gacha game, Honkai Star Rail. So I've never really played a mobile game prior to this, and the idea of paying for polls or whatever never really appealed to me. But I did want to give this game a try because it is based off of a turn-based JRPG, and I believe the producer is a big fan of Trails and said that they are very heavily inspired by that franchise. So I was really curious how they would translate that into a mobile game, especially since this is the same company that makes Genshin Impact, which I've heard a lot of good things over the years about it, despite it being rather addicting and time sinking. I'm not currently playing this game, and I'll go into reasons why, but I wanted to talk about it because it is available now on the PS5. So I'm sure there are plenty of people who are curious about it, especially as a free-to-play player, which is what I was. So I started up in April, shortly after it launched, and they're giving out so many different promos to entice people to give it a try. And overall, I thought all the character designs were top-notch, and the different worlds that they built in, I only went to the first few. I haven't played since, I want to say, August. So I'm sure there are plenty of patches I've missed since then in expansions. But I really did enjoy the narrative and how kind of snarky your character could be, depending on how they answer different questions. So I could definitely see from a dialogue perspective how they're heavily influenced by the Trails series. And I also did enjoy the turn-based combat system and how each character has their own special techniques and whatnot. But it did reach a point where I was getting tired of going through the different combat motions, especially when grinding for materials and experience. And I would just do auto battle for most of it, except when encountering some of the bosses in the main campaign. So I think there are a lot of pros to playing Honkai Star Rail, especially in the beginning when there's not too many expectations and it's very easy to kind of grow very quickly, especially if you have a lot of promos and free jade thrown at you. So it was kind of thrilling to do the gacha mechanics and pull for different characters. I was able to get most of the banner characters and some really good 5-star characters, so that was always fun. The point where I stopped was when the constant grind to level up the said characters to appropriate levels to get further, I guess, in the game was kind of weighing me down a bit. And the last banner character I tried to pull for, and then I think that was the only banner that I was unsuccessful in getting, was Kafka, which was one of the, I think, desirable characters in the game. She wasn't my favorite, but I think after kind of trying to get her within the time period, I kind of just fell off the game, mostly because it was getting a little tiring to do this daily, especially as a free-to-play player. I really didn't want to spend real money when it comes to the gambling aspects of the game and get sucked into that. I understand why people would do that, especially if they don't do it too often and want to support the developers of the game, but it was just nothing I really needed or felt I needed to do, especially with my big backlog of games that I've already spent money on that I would probably rather play instead of just grinding for materials on a daily basis. So I do think Honkai Star Rail is a good game, especially as a free-to-play player in the beginning. And I think some of the campaigns and different tournaments and things you could do are really fun. I missed out on the one where you kind of had the Pokemon battle system. That one looked fun, which I think if I were to go back into it, I think that might be the next campaign. But I really got tired of all the grinding and making sure that I sign in every day to get all the freebies, just to make sure my characters are an adequate level. And I could see how the game could also be boring if you spend a lot of money on it to level up all your characters, because I think once everyone's leveled up and there's no new story mode, you have to kind of wait for the new extension or patches to happen. I don't really know what else you would do in the game. Venturing into the gacha mobile games is a very slippery slope. So I decided that I've kind of done my fill. I enjoyed what I did in my experience, and I don't really have a desire to go back. So this next game is one that was the reason why I picked up a PS5 this year, and that is Final Fantasy XVI. So I actually received a digital code from Square Enix for free, intending to make a full-on video about Final Fantasy XVI. And sort of my experience as someone who's not super familiar with the Final Fantasy franchise. Aside from just playing Final Fantasy XII, a little bit of 13, and a little bit of OG 7. So unfortunately, that plan never happened, and it was definitely my fault, and I'll explain kind of why that was. But I was really excited to have Final Fantasy XVI as my first experience on the PS5, and testing out the new PS5 controller and kind of what the system could do. So there's a little bit of controversy with this game, especially among the JRPG community, for understandable reasons. And there are a few things I want to touch on when talking about this game from my perspective. Again, coming in without any biases about what Final Fantasy should be, because again, I haven't really played that many Final Fantasy games. And also just comparing it to other RPGs that I have experienced. So I guess I'll start off that by saying I did enjoy Final Fantasy XVI for what it was. There's some, I think, high highs that I really enjoyed during my playtime. And there were some gripes that, unfortunately, I think was the cause of my gaming burnout, which I'll get into in a bit. But first I'll talk about the combat. So this action combat was something new for the Final Fantasy franchise, and I thought they did a really good job. Everything felt very fluid, though I will say, especially in the early part of the game, I was kind of jamming buttons a little too hard, and it was definitely cramping my hands on that PS5 controller, which I want to say is a little bit overly sized, maybe for my hands. I don't know. It's not the most comfortable controller I've had. I have since gotten a little bit more used to it, but definitely I think starting out with an action combat game on that controller did not make it easy on my hands at all. So I had to take frequent breaks, especially during boss battles, which was unfortunate. Even sometimes mid-boss battles, I would have to pause it just because my hands were hurting so much. But as you kind of progress throughout the game, you do get more abilities that were really cool and fun to play around with, especially with the different combinations you could do. Forgot to mention, I did play this on the action version rather than the story version, because I did want the full experience. Though when it came to the accessories, the only one that I enabled was to have the dog Torgal act on its own, because I didn't want to have to worry about what the dog was doing and what I was doing at the same time. So I did use that accessory to help me out. But overall, I didn't think the difficulty was too bad. There were definitely some difficulty spikes in the later part of the game, and I did get some really good accessories. I think that kind of helped me get around some of the more difficult boss fights, especially when it came to the precision dodging, and I definitely took full advantage of those. And there was a point in time where I think I may have skipped this in the tutorial, or I just wasn't paying attention, but I didn't realize you can have another set of the special abilities, whatever they were called. So for the longest time, I was kind of toggling between two different special abilities, not realizing I could have equipped so many more to have different cooldown periods, and also just kind of get through some of those little mini bosses much quicker. And some of the progression just took so long because I felt like you were going after mini boss after mini boss after mini boss, and in my kind of warped mind that doesn't play Souls games, I kind of equated this to like a Souls game, where I just felt like I was just playing all these mini bosses all the time. And unlike other RPGs where you get to kind of grind and kind of kill and battle some of the lesser enemies to build up experience and everything, I felt like there was less of that and more focus on kind of more hardcore mini bosses, especially again during the early part of the game. So I found that a little odd, but something I adapted to. The side quests were also a little bit of controversial in this game. I was kind of the opinion that some of them were interesting, especially the ones that would give you things like when you can mount the chocobo, like that one. And there are a few other ones that had some cutscenes, but I'm gonna be honest, some of the cutscenes and the drama they try to insert into some of the side quests and also some of the mainline campaign felt a little too overhanded, and I think I didn't have as much of an emotional connection to some of the characters as I would have liked, and so that may have impeded my enjoyment of some of the side quests and the cutscenes throughout the game. So I felt that was a little bit of a bummer, because I kind of wished I enjoyed those a little bit more than I did, especially at the end where they threw just side quests left and right. And I actually did end up completing all the side quests, even the boring ones or just fetch quests. So I think my runtime was 56 hours in the game, maybe 60, around there. And the thing that I really didn't focus too much on were the bounties or the hunts. So I did a few of those in the beginning, but then they just got a little too repetitive and just unsatisfying to complete, so I just stopped doing them. But I think the most disappointing thing about Final Fantasy XVI for me was a lot of the conclusions, especially in the story narrative. I thought there were some interesting plot progressions that we saw throughout the campaign, and a few different twists and turns, but again, I think because I didn't have as much of an emotional connection to some of the characters, like I really wanted to like Clive, and there were a lot of, I think, great qualities about him. He just didn't feel like a real character to me, just because of how tragic his life was. It's really hard to put my finger on exactly what it is that I felt a disconnect, but I kind of felt a disconnect between him as well as Jill. I feel like we didn't get to know her as well as maybe we should have, especially with her connection with Clive. And the one character I really did enjoy, unfortunately we didn't see as much of them towards the end of the game for a certain reason. But I think, again, this kind of played into just how I felt when the game concluded. And not to go into spoilers at all, this will be spoiler free, but after I beat the game, I just felt like it was such an unsatisfying conclusion for me that all the time I spent, because I kind of went through this game really quickly, because I received a digital code when the game launched. I just got my PS5 and I just wanted to kind of go through this game as quickly as possible because, for one, I was interested in it and I wanted to see kind of what would happen before spoilers start coming out to the woodworks, and I did want to make content about this. But once I reached the end of the game, I just felt just so unsatisfied and a little hopeless at how it concluded. So I really didn't want to play any games for, I think, a few weeks is what happened. And I definitely didn't want to make a video about this game, even though for the most part I did enjoy it. Just that ending, man. That ending just kind of zapped the joy from me, if you will, of how I kind of perceived it throughout my experience in the game. So I'm really hoping, I haven't looked too closely at what the new DLCs are going to introduce. I think eventually I'll try them out, and I'm really hoping they're going to repackage this game with the DLCs once they're completed. Even if it's a DLC like code that they insert into the box, I probably would want to get that version just because I do want a physical version of this game, because I do like having a physical copy of a game that I enjoyed, just to kind of, I don't say have it as a trophy, but just as a memory on my shelf. Even though it's not necessarily the best memory, there are definitely some highs and lows, but for the most part, I really did enjoy Final Fantasy XVI. I do encourage people to try it. I would just kind of caution you that don't think it's going to be some mind-blowing conclusion, which, from my understanding, a lot of Final Fantasy games don't really have the mind-blowing conclusion that I think a lot of people kind of wish they had. Again, this is speaking from someone who hasn't played the Final Fantasy, so I might be totally wrong on this respect. But yeah, that was kind of my rambly explanation about my feelings towards Final Fantasy XVI. There's some very much conflicting feelings because I did enjoy the combat for the most part, and there were some epic boss battles, especially the one where they kind of cranked up the rock music and you got to kind of go up to certain heights that you wouldn't expect on that massive scale. And also, speaking of scale, there was some other boss battles that where you take flight, and it was definitely a very epic experience. I will admit that I didn't always like the Ifrit or the summons battling stuff. Some of it was very cool, but some of it did feel like a chore to kind of get through. But again, it was a little bit of a mixed bag. I think mostly positive, but there were some negatives that you can't help but remember. So out of all the games I've talked about so far, I'd be really curious to hear about everyone's thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI and what your experience was like. I think mine was mostly positive. Some gripes I definitely had with it, and it was the cause of my gaming burnout, so it kind of had that negative going for it as well. But overall, it was, I think, an interesting spin to the RPG franchise from Japan. And it'd be interesting to see what Square Enix decides to do with the next iteration for Final Fantasy. And if they're going to kind of continue with the more action style that we've been seeing, or if they're going to come back to turn-based or something else innovative, like maybe even a gambit system like from Final Fantasy XII, and see how that works in the new formula. The other game that I received a review copy of digitally, that I ended up buying a physical later on, is Atelier. This is another game that I received the digital code basically when the game came out. So this is kind of piggybacking on before, where I think I'm going to stop requesting or accepting review copies of games because I just can't complete them and make an interesting review within a reasonable time frame. And honestly, I don't think most people come to this channel expecting me to make interesting reviews all the time, because there's plenty of other channels that do a great job of doing that. I think everyone has their own niche, and I do like to think that I've carved my way into an interesting category when it comes to the game collecting side of YouTube, but I try to do everything that just interests me, because at the end of the day, this is still just a hobby for me. But getting back to Atelier Marie here, this is my first exposure to one of the earlier Atelier games. I've only have kind of a short history with the Atelier series, and I do want to play more of them. So far I've just completed the Ryza series, and I played a little bit of the Dusk trilogy too, mostly Aisha and a little bit of the second entry there. So I knew going in that Atelier Marie was going to be a little bit different compared to those because traditionally the first few Atelier games are very much a time management sim and kind of less of a carefree, casual JRPG. However, with this remake, it was interesting because they kind of give you the choice whether to have the time limit or no time limit. So when I started this up, I decided to go with the no time limit just to see how it went because I was a little anxious about the time limit because I do remember my time with Aisha where the time limit kind of stopped me in the middle of something that I wanted to finish. So I was a little disappointed at that cutoff. So I didn't want that to happen in this game in case I was going to run out of time. Which, spoiler here, I definitely had more than enough time to get to the ending of this game. And one thing I wanted to note before getting into the physical version of Atelier Marie here was that if you purchased the digital copy, you actually were able to play the original non-remastered version of the game, kind of in the original artwork, which I thought was interesting. And I'm surprised they didn't include that in this Play Asia copy. I didn't look at the download size of that specifically, but I can't imagine it would be that large and they wouldn't have been able to put it into this. But maybe this is a way to get people to double dip if they're really into the Atelier series and needed to have both the physical as well as playing in that original sort of art style. But overall, I thought Atelier Marie was very charming. And I did really like the graphics, even though there was a sort of weird blurring effect, especially around the edges of the screen, sort of like what you had with Link's Awakening on the Switch. The recruitment was interesting, how you would recruit different party members at a time and take them around to a few different locations to collect materials and to fight the various monsters. And you still had the calendar passing days going by, and I think when I was first playing this game, I was confused of whether or not I selected the correct mode, where I didn't want the time limit to affect my playstyle. So you'll still have the days passing by because some of the calendar dates and events are very important to do certain things on certain days in order for something to appear. But I believe when you play on the mode where you had no time limit, it will just kind of loop back in that calendar system on an annual basis without stopping until you reach one of the game's endings. But overall, I found this game to be almost painfully easy, especially in the combat and some of the synthesis parts. And that may be because I chose to play without a time limit, but I think even if I did enable the time limit to happen, I still would have had plenty of time. I just would have felt a little anxious with the time limit looming upon me in order to finish one of the routes. And I think there are 6 different endings you could have. I'm forgetting exactly what ending mine was. It was after making the special item with the special plant. I think it was the Philosopher's Stone or something like that is the one I ended up getting. And from what I could tell, it's not really worth playing through this multiple times to get the other endings because it's just kind of a small little cutscene. You definitely can, and there are definitely some interesting parts that I felt like I could have fleshed out more during my playthrough, because I think I only got maybe 50% of the dialogue cutscenes to appear. I think there's definitely a lot of things to explore if you wanted to max out those, but in the end, I didn't feel like it was too worth it. I felt like my 6 hours time in the game was more than enough for me to kind of enjoy the charm of Atelier Marie, but also appreciate where the Atelier series has since gone to that I found a bit more enjoyable than this more succinct, compact version. I had a few people ask me if this was a good entry point into the franchise, and honestly, I don't think it is. It definitely has its charms, as I mentioned before, and I didn't enjoy it, but that was more just in context of how this game fits into the rest of the Atelier games that I played. And I do think maybe starting with the first Ryza game, or even Sophie 2, or my first game was Atelier Aisha, and I really enjoyed that game. So I think starting with some of the other games might be a better way to go about it, rather than starting with the first game's remake, in my opinion. Now, the next game I played on the PS5 after kind of recovering from my long hiatus was Astro's Playroom. Now, this was such a charming experience and such a joy to play, surprisingly, for being kind of a tech demo of how the PS5 and the PS5 controller works. And it was such a callback to some of the 3D action platformers we had on prior PlayStation systems. For me, it was the PS2, and it was such a nostalgic thing to go through, and I loved how they integrated the history of PlayStation with all the different collectibles too. I would really love for Sony to make a sequel of some sorts or expand it somehow, because I really enjoyed playing it. I didn't fully collect everything, which I'm not a trophy hunter, but maybe I would try to do that for Astro's Playroom just for fun. I don't know how successful it'll be, but try to collect at least most of everything. I got a pretty good chunk collected. I think there's still plenty of puzzle pieces and things I didn't pick up. But yeah, this is definitely a game I think that's overlooked by many people, especially when talking about playing games on the PS5. So definitely if you are in the market or if you have a PS5 but haven't played Astro's Playroom, I highly suggest it. And so after Astro's Playroom, I also played another PS5 game to kind of get myself back into gaming again. And that was with Stray here. This game got so much buzz last year, and I purchased this prior to the PS5 in the hopes that it would be one of my first PS5 games that I play. And I'm really glad that I waited and got this on the PS5. So how this is almost described is like a cat simulator game, though not really. And it's a platformer without jumping, if that makes sense. So it was kind of weird to navigate the underground tunnels and the world kind of beneath the surface as a cat. And I really wish this was more of a traditional platformer, because I think having the flexibilities of a cat and interacting with the environment that way would have made it so much better. But I can understand why they didn't maybe go to those lengths, because having all the physics and things built around those environments in that sort of way would be more complicated. And this is an indie game, so maybe that wasn't just within their kind of realm of possibilities at the time of developing. But if they were to make a sequel of this game and incorporate more jumping mechanics or something like that, I think that would be really awesome. But I did thoroughly enjoy playing as a cat here and interacting with all the different robots and beings under the surface. And I thought all the different kind of dystopian-like towns and environments were really cool. I liked also the interactions and kind of how it incorporates some of the puzzle elements to kind of fully understand what was going on kind of in the scope of that world. So while this is usually advertised as kind of a cute, cozy cat game with some cool dystopian elements, there are some kind of scary parts in here too. Like, I personally dislike chase scenes as a whole, and there are these creatures that are kind of like oversized ticks that when they latch onto the cat, they suck its blood out, and if there are a ton of them that hook onto the cat for an extended period of time, you do see a lot of death scenarios that play out where you have to restart. So you have to be careful and run away from these things. So yeah, the chase scenes were definitely terrifying. So don't expect all just cute, cuddly cats in this game. There are some darker moments and some other kind of philosophical moments that would surprise you. And another thing to note is that this is a shorter game. I believe it only took me about 4 hours to complete, but I think it did help me get back into gaming again. And that, along with Astro's Playroom, kind of helped spark that feeling of joy that comes with gaming, that didn't feel like a chore or just like a depressing mess that Final Fantasy XVI sort of left me in. So I think Stray is a great short game to play in between longer games. And I wouldn't say Stray is the most innovative game ever I've played, especially on the indie front. I think as a package, it really crafts something very wonderfully together in a short 4 hours, which I think is really hard to do for a lot of games. But it very much, I think, excelled in that, and I really hope we see a sequel of some sorts in the future. Now, the last game I want to talk about that I played also on the PS5 is Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. So I was very excited to play this as one of the, I guess not anymore PS5 exclusives. I'll say it's the PS5 physical exclusive, since you can play this now on Steam. But I do have a history with the Ratchet and Clank series, and definitely loved all the ones that came out of the PS2 era. Unfortunately, I never had a PS3, so I never played the Ratchet and Clank titles on that system, but I was really excited to kind of get back into the franchise with the latest one on the PS5. So what can I say that hasn't been said already about this game? It is visually beautiful, and I think it looks great on a nice big screen. I'm using an HD monitor, and I will say that there are times where I do feel kind of motion sickness a little bit. I can't play for longer than 4 hours at a period of time. I felt the same way actually with Final Fantasy XVI. And I did have the mode where it was supposed to be less motion blur or whatever it was. But I still can't look at the screen for longer than 4 hours usually. So I always have to take breaks, which I guess is the healthy thing to do, right? So I guess that's not too much of a negative. But it was really cool revisiting these characters again, seeing some familiar ones and some new ones. And I liked how you switched back and forth between the two different lead characters with Ratchet and the new character that's introduced. I thought that was an interesting dynamic that kind of changed things up. I will say that the humor didn't hit quite as much as it did during the PS2 era. I don't know if this is because I'm older and I don't find it as funny anymore. I might also just have a recall bias where I thought it was hilarious back in the day when it really wasn't. But I thought there was a good variety in the different weapons, and the different environments were really cool to explore in, as well as the different abilities too, with the hover boots and whatnot. I felt like all the mini games they had spread out through the story were not too difficult. They're at kind of like the right level where they're definitely all doable. A couple of them had me think like the Clank one, where it's very similar to that other game that came out in the indie scene, where you lead all the different bodies to exit out through a certain portal. And there are a couple that I found a little annoying to do, like the virus shooting one was a little annoying. Not difficult, it was just a little annoying. But overall, I kind of felt transported back to being a kid again, playing a 3D action platformer, and again, revisiting Ratchet and Clank in a new story. So I thoroughly enjoyed this game, and I don't think you have to play the prior entries at all in order to enjoy Ripped Apart. I think it definitely helps to have a better basis of who these characters were from the beginning, and kind of the trials and tribulations they went through, especially with the lead enemy and how that's kind of changed in the new game with the dynamics and such. And part of me is a little bit sad that this might be the last Ratchet and Clank game we'll ever have, because it seems like Insomniac Games wants to do some other things, which is understandable, because those are a little more successful for them, like Spider-Man. And if that were the case, I do feel like this is a solid way to kind of go out with this franchise. And this was also another fairly short game. I'm used to 50-hour plus long games, so I think I clocked in around 17 hours for this one. I did about everything. I didn't max out all the upgrades, and I didn't get all the golden screws, but I think I played most of it and was pretty satisfied with what I did play. I'm not totally sure how this runs in Steam, but on the PS5 it was pretty flawless, as to be expected. So very high recommendation, especially if you enjoy 3D action platformers and feel any sort of nostalgia for this sort of game. All right, so I'm gonna cut it off here because I'm sure I've been rambling about games for a long time, and I will continue in a part 2 talking about a few more games that I've been playing recently. To give you a little preview, here are some of them that I'll be talking about. So a good mix of different types of games, and a few other ones that I'll throw in as a few surprises as well. So stay tuned for that, and my goal is to have that out by the end of this year. Part of me is a little disappointed that I wasn't able to put this out a little bit sooner, when some of my thoughts about these games were a bit more fresh, and I wouldn't have as many to talk about, so I could focus a little bit more on particular games and go a little bit more into detail with them. So I'll try to do that better next year, once I get a good batch of games, maybe restricted to 3 or 4, just so that I could thoroughly talk about them and I guess ramble about them really. So let me know if you guys like this sort of format. I enjoy doing these, I think, more than reviews, because when it comes to reviews, there's just so much stress and expectations of writing and formulating a good review to inform you of what sort of game it is and if it's something you would consider buying or not. So I don't feel necessarily qualified to do that and take that on, especially with the amount of time I have to devote to making videos and content on a regular basis. So I think I'll be sticking to this more casual, informal way of talking about games, and I hope you guys don't mind that too terribly. But if you stuck around this long, I guess I'll go into some things of what's been happening with me, since I haven't posted a video in over a month. So I guess the short explanation of this is that I've been job hunting, and after I attended my conference, I had plans to film and make some more videos, but I got a call back, and I did some Zoom interviews that led me to becoming a finalist in a very, I guess, prestigious position. I feel like I reveal a little bit too much about myself when talking about my job, so I'm not going to go too into detail, but I'll just say that it's a very desirable academic position that it's very difficult to come by. So I had to do a lot of preparations to do various presentations and in-person interviews for that job. I'm still waiting to hear back on the decision for that, so I'm hoping for the best. If I don't get it, then I'll just have to continue with my job hunting grind. It's unfortunately a very long process, especially if you're in a very niche field like I am. But I think moving forward, I am going to strive to post at least 4 times a month. If not more, if I have time, and if I'm inspired to talk about something. But yeah, I find that YouTube as a hobby is very fulfilling, so I do want to continue doing it. Even though I mentioned, I think before, I don't really have plans to be a full-time YouTuber or anything. That's not really my career path at all. Of course, things may change, but I really don't anticipate that happening anytime soon. But yeah, I wanted to explain a little bit of my absence. I am pretty active, I think, on Twitter. So if you're interested in following me on there, I try to post rather frequently. I probably post a little bit too much, but yeah, I'm pretty active on there. And I'll try to remember to use my community tab a little bit more to inform you guys of what I've been up to, in case I can't post a video that week. It's just something I have to remember doing. But my next video is going to be a little bit different. It's going to go through some consoles that I've purchased this past year, and I guess make some updates about how I feel about them and whether or not they're worth purchasing in 2024. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that, as well as part 2 of the games I've been playing lately. And I just showed you a preview of 6 of them, so there might be a couple more added to that list, but should be, I think, another long-winded, rambly sort of video. So until then, bye guys.